Now it
Okay,
is.
great. You know, for those of you that aren't here, we are having mimosas, actually.
Your glass disappeared. There it
I
is.
was expecting you to be here, John, if anybody.
I was expecting them to be delivered to my door, actually.
You got high expectations, huh?
Hey, look at the year I had, so why not?
And Cheryl, I'm surprised you're not here drinking, knowing what's been going on with your latest transaction, huh?
If it hadn't been raining so hard, I was gonna be there, Rich. Yeah, it's kind of calmed down now.
Well, good. I'm glad to hear that.
Yes, I think we may do the whole transaction.
Oh, good. Great.
Yeah,
So is everybody's Christmas decorations down and away?
they're down, but they're not back up in the attic yet.
They're not packed. Mine came down late Christmas night, as a matter of fact. I had enough.
Yeah, we had a good excuse to take ours down before we left and put them
Oh,
away.
you did. You did. How was the trip, by the way?
It was long and exhausting, but a lot of fun.
Oh, good.
Actually, even had wedding crashers,
Did you?
which I was told is normal for the Philippines. And I said, unfortunately, it was a shame that I was mic'd for the whole day, because what I had to say about them, I'm sure the photographers got a real kick out of it, but fortunately it did not show up on any of the videos.
You had a live mic on the entire day.
Yes.
Wow,
Yeah.
you're a brave man. I don't think I would do that.
I actually, you forget about it. They
I
put it
would
on,
think
put it
so.
off, and you forget about it when it's on. And it was actually very cool the way they did the whole thing. And then they would ask questions of us during the day. And by the end of the wedding, they sat us down on the dance floor, and they played the video that they had been editing for the whole day.
That's really cool. I haven't heard of anyone doing that before.
Yeah. So, I mean, we had that wedding album. We don't even have the one from this one done, or even we just received pictures to view. But that one was done and handed to us before we got on a plane.
Wow, that is so cool.
Yeah.
What a
Philippines.
great idea. Okay, I think it's after 10 o'clock. Well, hello, everybody. How are you? Thanks for coming today. Got many exciting things to talk about as usual. And Mary, are you ready to begin today's presentation? First of all, Happy New Year. It's good to see everybody. Woohoo, yeah. Glad 2022 is behind us.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, something we can all agree on. Well, we're going to welcome, first of all, Mary Kwok with Lawyer Seidel. Mary, hello.
Good morning, everyone. Happy New Year. Wait, where am I supposed to look? Right here. Hi, everyone. Good morning. I'm sorry that more of you are not here. I'd give you a big New Year's hug. I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes. I think it's a great time to remind all of you. For those of you that are not out and about as much, wire fraud is real. Wire fraud still takes place. It is probably the largest crime in our country, especially hitting the real estate industry. And I think we're kind of in the clear timing wise. I see the most prominent numbers of wire fraud taking place during the holidays when things get really busy. We actually just had one ourselves, and it did end up with a good story at the end. But my kind of takeaway for you guys is, in any situation, whether it's a buyer or a seller, you want to make sure that everyone is placing an outbound call to verify their wire instructions. Don't ever take something from an email. Don't ever take an inbound call either, is the other thing, because there are actually situations where the fraudsters will place calls and purport to be someone from escrow and saying that it's an assistant because the officer's out. So there's all sorts of different things. We just have to be really diligent. And then on a marketing note, I want you guys to all know that I have some fabulous reports available. Some of you do receive it from me time to time for different marketing areas that you're farming in. They're called Altos reports, and I've got some hard copies to pass out to our friends here today. It's essentially a 1-week report. You can do it by city or you can do it by zip code. And it is segregated by SFR and condos. And they're really great when you're talking with clients that are super analytical and numbers people. So we have these available anytime you need them. And I, of course, am always available when you guys are ready to re-strategize, reframe your farms, and talk about some marketing for the new upcoming year. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mary. Appreciate it. Great. Appreciate it. I'd like to introduce Sarah Menchaca with Southern California Funding. Sarah, how are you today?
Hi, Rich. Happy New Year, everyone.
Happy New Year.
So I have just a quick market update. At the last meeting, the Fed did increase the rates by 50 basis points. The projection for this year is looking like it might be less. There's talk of it maybe being a 0.25% higher at the next Fed meeting, which will be February 1st. Inflation does look like it's getting, kind of closer to where they want it to be. So they're expecting that the rate increases will be less this year. They're not saying that we won't have increases. They're saying that it just might be less. With that being said, we're about the same with interest rates that we were the last time I gave an update, which was back on December 6th. So for a conforming loan, we're looking to be between 5.875 to 6.439 with 0 to 1 points being charged. On a high balance, we're looking at 6.25 to 6.891 with 0 to 1 points being charged. And on a jumbo loan, we're looking at around 6.375 to 6.75. So on all those scenarios, it's assuming that it is a single family home with a credit score of 740 or higher and putting down at least 25%.
Anybody have any questions for Sarah? Okay, Sarah, thank you very much. Really appreciate you participating today.
You're welcome.
Yeah, great. So please contact Sarah if you need any assistance or guidance in regards to financing for your clients. So every 6 months, CAR always updates forms. And of course, there's always material changes to the documents. And there's a number of changes, and we're probably going to have time to get through the purchase agreement today in regards to what the changes consist of and just an understanding of that. So I've got the forms, I'll be showing them to you. And for the most part, you should be able to see the changes in red print. So that should help you in some manner, right, to understand exactly what we're talking about. Actually, no, it's not. If you turn the other one off, please. Thank you, John. Great. So starting with section E1, loan amounts, as you can see in red now, that's been modified again. The very first bullet point states not to exceed. So we would insert a cap of an interest rate in there. So if rates are 6.5 today, maybe we would insert a rate of 6.75 to 7%. Let's give some flexibility so the transaction doesn't fail. Next, buyer to pay up to, and we should insert a maximum number of points there, because if we insert nothing, then of course there could be no limitation in regards to the number of points that a borrower may have to pay just to get the interest rate stipulated above. So please keep that in mind. And then you can see section E2, it's talking about secondary financing. It could be a second deed of trust, for example. It's the same information, a rate not to exceed whatever the cap would be that the buyer could potentially afford, and then the number of points. So insert the minimum number of points. Now in the past, I haven't tried it this time. Past forms where we were able to insert that, it wouldn't accept 0. Unfortunately, it would only accept 1. You can always override that when you're sending out digital signatures. Also, you can manually insert that.
Hey, Rich,
Yes, John.
why does it matter that the buyer to pay up to a certain point, and why is it not in there buyer / or seller, and check one of those? As we know, most sellers now are paying for the points.
But the seller has to agree to pay for the points. If the seller doesn't agree, as we can in, for example, section G1 specify a seller credit. However, if the seller counters that out, then of course there's going to be no assistance from the seller on the buyer's behalf in regards to the points that the buyer may be obligated to pay. Is that answering your question, John?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. All right, thank you. And then section G1. Now, even though nothing is highlighted here, I think what's very important, we're going to see this in the counteroffers that have been modified. When we're talking about the seller credit, if any, let's just read it. It says a dollar amount, percentage of purchase price. Number above is for calculation purposes and it's not a contractual item or term. And what that's telling us is the percentage itself is only a calculation and nothing more than that. So if you're to insert $10,000 in there and the price is negotiated up or down, the credit is not going to be adjusted. It is going to remain at $10,000. So we'll keep that in mind. We'll see that further down in the RPA, as a matter of fact. And then another big change that's taken place, section G3, seller agrees to pay the obligation of buyer to compensate buyer's broker under a separate agreement. I'll just read it and then we'll go through it. And that's referring to form SPBB, which is seller payment of buyer's broker. Seller's broker's offer, if any, so that's the listing agent, to compensate buyer's broker is unaffected unless otherwise agreed.
So that's in addition to.
Yes, it is. It is, as a matter of fact. Let's just pull up the form. So this is the new form. Possibly, why might this be used? Well, if, for example, the buyer did sign a buyer representation agreement and the total compensation the buyer agreed to pay the agent representing them is 2.5%. However, the compensation offered on the MLS is only 2%. You may ask that the seller pay that differential. So that's a distinct possibility. And I think a lot of these changes that we're going to see, it's getting to the point in time that they're forcing us more and more to completely disclose what the compensation is going to be earned on a transaction when representing a buyer. And that seems to be the direction that everything is going in.
Question I have
What's that?
about that. I thought I read that as in addition to as opposed to in replacement of. For example, suppose somebody had said the buyer broker or the buyer agreement is that I'll give you 10 grand to represent me. And then this other one says, you know, as it's advertising MLS that you're going to get 2%. Would it not be 2% plus the 10 grand, or if that 2%, let's say?
No, it would not be plus. So the buyer representation agreement is going to cap the amount of compensation that the buyer is obligated to pay.
Right. But it's so this is $1 million house,
Mhm.
2%, and it's offering 2%. So the buyer's broker or the buyer's agent would get 20,000. Has a separate one from the buyer saying you're going to be 10,000 to represent. Checking that box, that wouldn't that say he's going to get the 2% plus this seller's agreeing to pay
If the buyer agreed,
10,000?
if the buyer agreed to pay $10,000 and allowed the agent representing the buyer to receive whatever's offered on the MLS, then yes, that would be applicable here in that example.
So it could be 30. Depends on
Could
what-
be in that
how big the
example. It
markup.
seems to be more likely that the buyer's probably going to be capping it at 2 or 2, say 3%, whatever the case may be. 2 is going to be offered on the MLS, and they could be responsible for the delta or that 1% in the example of mine.
Gotcha, okay.
So that's what I think it's for. As a matter of fact, that's the intended aspect of it. But let's just go through the seller payment to buyer brokers form so we can have a complete understanding of it. So the buyers entered into a written agreement to compensate buyer's broker. This is a buyer representation agreement, and that has changed substantially this year, as a matter of fact. And that's a percentage of the purchase price or objected dollar amount. So as of the date, this seller payment for buyer's broker document, that's the current form we're looking at, is signed by buyer, and pursuant to the MLS, seller's broker, which is a listing agent, has agreed to pay buyer's broker. In this case, we'll just make an assumption that the offer of compensation is 2.5% on the MLS. And then it states, seller agrees to pay buyer's broker a percentage of the purchase price, or I've checked a certain dollar amount, no greater than the applicable percentage in paragraph 1. So we have a buyer representation agreement that's saying the buyer is going to pay the buyer's agent 2.5%. And in no case is the compensation going to exceed that. So keep that in mind. Now it's placing the burden on the escrow holder how do you know if you're representing a buyer, you're going to be compensated? Well, once they sign it, you can actually submit that document. It's an irrevocable demand that you would submit to escrow to show the escrow holder that you're entitled to that compensation. So that's why it's saying now that buyer authorizes escrow holder upon request to deliver to seller a copy of the portion of the written agreement between buyer and buyer's broker, identifying the amount of the compensation. What's that saying? That the escrow holder should be receiving a copy of the buyer representation agreement. Now, we're not seeing many buyer representations being used, but it is taking place. And there's some reasons today to not use it. It's written better, but if we use the current buyer representation agreement, probably something we're not going to cover today, it is causing you to disclose to the buyer any anticipated compensation for any property you're going to be showing. And that's what the buyer representation agreement now mandates, that you give in advance to that buyer written documentation showing what the compensation is going to be earned on that transaction or that property that you're showing them. For me, I find that not productive. I would find myself not entering into the buyer representation agreement that's current simply because of that reason. It is. It really is, because otherwise the buyer representation agreement did a couple new things. It can be a non-exclusive agreement. And so I would say, or suggest that a buyer is more likely to enter that. It can also be created as an exclusive agreement, meaning no matter who represents the buyer, the agent who received that buyer's representation agreement would be entitled to compensation. So good things on page 1, bad things on page 2. You must disclose it all. In addition to that, I don't know if anybody noticed on CRMLS, when you log in, there was a new message. I think we all disregard those. I happen to read this one myself, and it indicated a report that you can use to show your buyer the offered compensation, but it also tells you immediately that you cannot disclose to the buyer the private remarks in the MLS. You're prohibited from giving the buyer or any principal the private remarks in the MLS. That's what it's saying in that information that's showing on private remarks.
Yeah, sometimes they say that the debt on the property, whatever, it's all in the private remarks, but aren't you supposed to be?
Well, the agents, but not giving it to your client.
But then aren't you supposed to be disclosing it to your client?
The information maybe depends what the information consists of. Any questions about that? God, we have so much excitement here today.
It's so funny.
I just can't take it. But I appreciate the questions, and I like that. It's easier when you're in person, except for John Barris. He has no objection to asking any questions at any time of the day, right, John?
Absolutely.
Thank you, John. So as we skip down to section L4, L5, L6, and L7, it talks about delivery of documents, and the default time frame has not changed. But what's interesting, and we're going to see this in section 14B3, if we look at L4, for example, it says 17 days after acceptance or 5 days after delivery, whichever is later. So what does that mean? If you deliver any of the documents, and at any point in time, this is what it's suggesting, the buyer, the recipient, has the contingency period equal to 17 days or 5 days following receipt of those disclosures. So if the disclosures are delivered on day 17, the buyer has through day 23 to remove contingencies. But this is just saying 5 days after delivery. However, we look at 14B3, it specifies that. It says if not delivered within the first 7 days, only then does the 5-day rule apply. Now, that's not terribly applicable today, because let's assume on day 8, the disclosures are delivered. So the buyer is entitled to a contingency period equal to the greater of 17 days or 5 days following receipt. So if we receive the documents on day 8, we have through day 13 to remove contingencies. The greater of, right? So it's the greater of. But the difference is going to be, and this is a thing of the past right now, if we have a short time frame for removal of contingencies, if it's a 10-day contingency period. So if documents are delivered on day 8, So instead of a 10-day time frame for removal of contingencies, now the buyer has 13 days in total. So that's when it matters. But this is not necessarily clear in regards to what it's telling here, and I just wanted to make sure everybody understood that. Then section M3, occupied units by tenants or anyone other than seller. The contract itself is based upon the premise that it's going to be an owner occupied property. However, if any of the units or if the unit the buyer is acquiring is tenant occupied and they're not aware of it, the seller has an obligation, if we look over to the right, to disclose that and attach form TOPA to tell them that the property is tenant occupied. And of course, that's very important. So it says, seller shall disclose to buyer if occupied by tenants or persons other than the seller and attach TOPA and a counteroffer if not part of buyer's offer. So that can be very important. I make an offer. I think it's seller occupied. They're going to move out in a timely manner. But what if it's tenant occupied and that tenant most likely or is not going to move out? I need to be made aware of that. And I have an opportunity to find the buyer to proceed or not to proceed. But let's look at the TOPA because it's another aspect of it that's very important. And this is in regards to the rent cap and just cause laws. So here's the tenant occupied property addendum, the document we were just talking about. And now, if I'm the listing agent, pardon me? Carlos is buying a house, yeah. And Richard, guess what? No. So he's selling, I'm buying. See, Paul reads these documents. I appreciate that. That's good. So the default is the tenant to remain in possession. However, if we check the box for 1B, the property is to be delivered vacant. So I would suggest under section 1B subsection 2 that we don't accept the default, meaning that it must be vacated by the close of escrow, but we want it vacant 5 days or so many days in advance. Now, if for some reason the tenant doesn't move out, you're laughing, Paul.
No, isn't that already in the
No.
The RPA already states if it's tenant occupied.
Used to.
That doesn't say that anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is a form that's supposed to be included if it's tenant occupied.
Doesn't make much work.
It is. That's exactly what we're talking about today. A lot more.
It was already there.
Yeah, it was on there. Right.
And now you got a whole form you got to add.
Yeah, a whole little form has been there. So now that we all agree, we don't want to add these additional forms. I would suggest that you check the box 5 days, that the tenant must vacate 5 days prior to the close of escrow, so you know that it's taking place. And a long time ago, I forgot which revision of the RPA before, the buyer didn't have the opportunity to just, well, actually, they probably didn't have to close, but now the buyer's recourse, if the tenant doesn't move out, is very limited. They can cancel the transaction and they can recover their costs of the appraisal and inspection, nothing more than that. They can't sue for specific performance. I'm sorry, what? Yeah, they'd be entitled to get their earnest money back. Yeah,
Or they can sue for their costs.
only, no, it's limited. That's the problem. They can only be entitled to recovery of out-of-pocket expenses for inspection and appraisal fees.
Now, look, suppose they're from out of state and they flew here for their inspection. Can they sue for their flights and their hotel and everything else?
No.
Just the
appraisal fees and inspection fees. Unfortunately. But the other important aspect of this form, and this is important in any type of a lease transaction, is under section 2B, government compliance. It's talking about the compliance or a warranty by the seller. So if the property is tenant occupied, remember it's subject to the rent cap and just cause laws, which are not always favorable for somebody. So attached to the TOPA is the RCJC for reference purposes only. And why is that important? Because remember, if you're a landlord, you must have that form provided to the tenant. You should always include that in the lease, and the current lease agreements include the form anyways. And you should be telling the tenant whether you are or are not exempt from the rent cap and just cause eviction laws. Pardon me? Yeah, you check the box. Now, in this case, it's just, but the point is, if you're representing a buyer and the buyer is acquiring a tenant occupied property, do you know if the landlord, the existing landlord, provided the RCJC, check the box that they are exempt? So, and if that's the case, assuming the ownership interest is similar from your buyer, they should be entitled to the exemption. But what if they're not? What if the RC, and I see it often, and Brian sees it more than me, a lot of people don't check the box on the exemption form. And if they don't check the box, even though they're entitled to the exemption, they're subject to the rent cap and just cause eviction laws, meaning there's only 17 reasons why you can terminate a tenancy.
I have a question.
Yes.
So I've renewed a lease last year, filled that form out, checked the box. I extended the lease this year, increased the rate. Did not provide that because on the extension, I put all terms and conditions of previous terms are in place with the exception of the extension and that. Are we still okay?
Yes, you are. You're in full compliance because it's been delivered to the tenant.
Great, thank you.
Certainly, certainly. So that's why this form is important. Keep in mind, it's going to show you the RCJC just as a reference point, nothing more than that. It doesn't mean anybody has to complete it, but it's putting you on notice that you, Mr. Buyer, may or may not be entitled to the exemption for a couple of reasons. One, because the seller never took advantage of the exemption, never provided the correct form, or maybe you, Mr. Buyer, aren't entitled to the exemption for some reason, because if it's an LLC in which there's, for example, an entity that owns a part of the LLC that's a corporation, you're not entitled to the exemption. In most cases, I'd say most entities are entitled to the exemption, but they don't take advantage of it. And that's probably more the issue. Well, then if it's a tenancy, it's a month-to-month tenancy. What you can do to cure the situation, you can send the RCJC, with the box checked appropriately, attached to a notice of change in terms of tenancy. And 30 days after delivery, that then becomes a part of the lease agreement. But if it's an existing long-term lease agreement, you cannot unilaterally change the terms of the lease agreement. When allows, yes, they'd have to agree to sign the RCJC. If they don't, then you're not entitled to the exemption. You have to wait till lease renewal at best. Hopefully I covered that thoroughly enough. So we covered that, and then you can see section N2, we're back to the RPA, shows sign and return escrow holder provisions 5 days after delivery. So your client gets the escrow instructions, so they should be returning the documents within 5 days. Scroll on down here, a lot of it hasn't changed. And then I like this change actually, home warranty plan chosen by buyer. Coverage includes but is not limited to. Before, it didn't default to the buyer making the choice. And I like the fact that the buyer's the one making the choice. I don't want to make the choice as a listing agent. And then you look to the right, if you were to say both pay for it or whatever the case may be, and you would actually in the far right, specify a cap that the seller is obligated to pay. So maybe seller's willing to pay only $700, but the buyer wants a policy that costs $1,000. So this addresses that. No further documentation is required. The buyer then has agreed to pay for that differential. Do you say something, Paul?
Is there a reason to, on the first section on the left, to actually write something in, but not limited to blah, blah, blah?
Under next to Q18.
Yeah, in those lines.
I think
Is there crucial that you ought to write something there?
I think for once, let's assume that the seller agreed to pay $1,000, whatever the case may be, the seller agreed to it. I think if we don't specify those additional options, the seller may not have an obligation to pay up to $1,000. So if I don't include an AC option or a roof option, wherever the case may be, and the cost of the warranty is less, I never specified I wanted those upgrades. So it's possible that it could affect the buyer negatively.
So the buyer, so let's say, okay, seller's cost not to exceed $800, and then your home warranty, you're going to put in whatever pool coverage, this, that, it ends up being more like, and let's say the base was 500, but with all these upgrades, it's 750. You're saying if you didn't write down that you also wanted the pool and the other coverages, that maybe they would have only paid the 500, even though it says.
Yes, I think it's
1,500?
debatable. If we don't add to it some characterization that it is not just limited to the base policy. That's my read on it. Somebody might contest it. I doubt if it's going to happen, but somebody could. We always see people fighting over the smallest of dollar amounts. No, that's a good question. And then the mixed use purchase addendum, I don't think I'll just show you that quickly. But if there is a mixed use property, there are ranch, there could be mixed use properties, right? You're living below, you might be renting out that commercial area of it, as a matter of fact. And of course, there's other types of properties that are mixed use, but there is an addendum addressing that. And there's an array of questions that you would ask about that. How many residential units, possession, so on and so forth, what's included or not included, allocation of costs. So it gets very detailed. And obviously, what if you're buying a property and you're going to occupy the residential portion, but then someone is occupying the commercial portion? You probably would want income and expense statements, estoppel notices, so you know what the terms of the lease are. So that's where that can become applicable. I don't see this being used very often. And then section 5A3, retention of deposit. This is in reference to liquidated damages. So it talks about the release of the deposit not to exceed a certain amount. And we look through the details of the contract in the event the buyer defaults and there is a deposit. However, section 3II regarding possible liability and remedies if buyer fails to deliver the deposit. Well, what if the buyer never made their deposit? So the liquidated damages clause found further, I think in section 27, addresses that, or it says that the release of money is for the deposit made, but what if no deposit was ever made? What's the recourse that a seller has against a buyer for default? So now this is putting everybody on notice that there could be other implications if the buyer defaults and there's no deposit made.
So what talk about what about the amount of deposit? If it's legally they're not entitled to more than 3%.
If it's a residential property that's going to be owner occupied, there's no cap if it's not a primary residence.
So it could be investment properties, you get 20%.
It could be.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's assume it's a 3%, but which is the reason I believe that around here anyway, it's typical that that's what the seller wants the buyer's EMD to be is 3%. But that's very atypical in the Inland Empire, where it's more like, oh, $1,000 or $5,000 or something
Small. Yeah.
But so in this case, this is the are they entitled to only from what the buyer actually EMD was, which could have been $1,000, or is it they still are entitled to up to 3%? They would just have to sue for the rest.
If they agree to the liquidated damages clause, they're limited to only the greater of or the deposit or 3%.
Whichever is larger.
Yeah, excuse me, the lesser of, exact opposite. So in your case, it'd be entitled to $1,000. That's
right.
it.
So you want to push to that 3%.
You do for those reasons. And then what if they don't even make their deposit? What are the implications? Because everybody thinks, oh, I didn't make my deposit, I can just walk away from the contract. Well, that's not true. You need to cancel it. And then we talked about this earlier, but occupancy of buyer intends to occupy as a primary residence or secondary residence unless otherwise agreed to in the car form TOPA. The unit buyer intends to occupy shall be vacant at the time of possession, or whatever the case is, right? And then if the property is not seller occupied and tenant occupied, the seller has an obligation contractually to notify the buyer of that on a form TOPA. That's a contractual obligation. And then section, I missed the number, sorry. 8.
There's a question, Rich.
There is, I'm sorry, okay.
Yeah, what is the seller's obligation about disposing of room in the property in which a lease contract is being leased out?
If there's a lot, that would be a lodger. They would have an obligation to disclose that. That's a tenancy. And even if it's not formalized, if it's a week-to-week tenancy, whatever the case may be, they'd have an obligation to disclose that. But evicting a lodger is much easier than evicting a traditional tenant. Much easier. So that's the good news. And under section F, the words and approval, right? So the buyer's review and approval. And how do we know when they approve it? Because when they remove their contingencies. And then section I, it talks about for any contingency specified in paragraph 3L or 8 or elsewhere. And that means you can even add your own contingencies, right? And it talks about the contingency period under section I2, 5 days after delivery. However, in this section, it is not giving the full explanation that it's 5 days after delivery of the contingency period is equal to the greater of the specified contingency period or 5 days following delivery. But the only reason the 5-day rule is invoked is if delivery occurs after 7 days. If it's delivered within the 7 days, including the 7th day, then they're only entitled to the contingency period specified in the contract, and the default 17 days. You might change that to 10 days. So you can see the implications. And then under items included, it's including any associated hardware and rods for drapery. I can't believe people still take those things. And then pool heaters, that would surprise me. People are taking their pool heaters with them. God, it just doesn't end, right? There's always a snake out there. And then in devices that are included or not included with the security system, is an Alexa device included? May not be. I don't know. I'd probably clarify that.
The checkbox where it says refrigerator, washer,
Yes.
dryer. If you checkbox on your security system, that's benefit to that. Otherwise, it may not be included.
But yeah, right. If we have to exclude non-dedicated devices, because here it says all smart home and security system control devices are included in this sale, except for any non-dedicated personal computer, tablet, or phone.
Automatically.
I think it's just a question. I don't know the answer. I'm sitting here wondering. Yeah, check, right. Remove or exclude all non-dedicated security devices. That's probably the best choice. You may not have any. Yeah. And then let's see, allocation of costs. Remember in under the section 3, where we're defining who's paying, it is simply just defining who's paying for the cost of the report. We see exceptions with termite people. Sometimes we'll say the cost of the report and a section 1 termite clearance. So that then would clarify it. But the best language is found in the request for repairs under that also. And you can see section C, buy or sell, choose a home warranty plan, right? It's just got to fall within their guidelines, whatever that may be, or what's good for them. And then this is very important now. Solar panels are found in many homes. So for properties with any solar panels or solar power systems, seller shall, within the time specified in paragraph 3N, which is 7 days, by the way, deliver to buyer all known information about the solar panels or solar system, and you may use the new solar form, and we're going to be implementing that since we have so many transactions that include solar panels. Yeah, there you go. Now, the form itself, it's just simply a disclosure. So the good news is when we send these forms out and you're sending it through zip forms, it's sent electronically, ideally. So it should simplify your life a little bit, right? So we're not asking you to fill in any information, but it talks about the form of ownership. And also it even states many owners believe that they own the solar panels, but they may not. There's probably a lot of confusion, as a matter of fact. Then it talks about properties or solar panels that can be leased. Now we see also solar panels that are financed through a PACE or HERO loan. You're not going to see necessarily an encumbrance on title, but when you look at the property tax bill, you're going to see that the encumbrance is shown as being paid through their property tax assessment. Yes. And on the SBQ, the seller should be disclosing that. And also you'll see here farther down in the form, there are check boxes now that we're going to ask the seller to complete to help us understand whether or not the property is encumbered. There could be a UCC filing against solar panels or personal property. So UCC filing should show up, tell me this, on a preliminary title report.
Yes, it will.
So on a property profile too.
On a property, oh, well,
Yes.
okay.
Yes.
And remember, that's just a notice of an encumbrance filed against personal property. That's what a UCC filing is. I guess the analogy would be a deed of trust, where a lender records a deed of trust against a property.
Is that for these ones?
It can be, however, it depends who's financing it and how they want to securitize the lien against that property. So it could be a UCC filing. It could be a separate instrument, maybe that's not securitized by a UCC filing. So it's a big surprise to a buyer when they acquire a property if they're not aware that they're assuming a payment, and maybe there's an obligation associated with that.
Well, that comes up in escrow anyway.
Should come up in escrow, right?
Search on the hero ones, there have been a lot of instances where it's on the prelim, it's everywhere. Buyer initial that they reviewed the prelim, but then 6 months later, they didn't realize.
They didn't realize.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And remember, that's the form of financing that's shown on the tax bill. Now, Fannie Mae, their guidelines will not allow a buyer to obtain a loan without a PACE or HERO loan being paid off. But it happens. It happened in our office, as a matter of fact. Fortunately, we had full disclosure of it because the buyer came back, we were the listing office, and wanted us to compensate them for the additional costs that they weren't aware of. But they acknowledged disclosure in 3 different areas. So those are all very important aspects, as a matter of fact. So even though you think it's going to be paid off, if it's a PACE or HERO loan, there's no assurance that the lender is going to catch it.
Like, probably then getting a lesson, just ask the seller if there is sort of, and then get a copy of a bill or
You
what
can look it up
showing
online.
that it's been paid off.
Oh, Paul just said you can look it up
Well,
online,
it's all
first of all.
public record. You can just look up the address
For-
online.
And if it's
and it'll
UCC filing
show you-
or,
It'll show you every itemized down exactly what the tax bill is.
if it's on the tax bill.
Well.
That's the
Case-
point.
Case or hero would be.
Yes, that would be, but the other
Yeah.
forms would not be on that.
Sure.
Well, what should you do? Well, actually, I'd say probably we should get this form completed after the fact. I don't know if I'm going to beat my seller up with all these disclosures to begin with, because they may not sign my listing contract with me. Uh-huh.
While you're giving out the disclosures to the buyer, just get a copy of the bill to be sure.
Sure.
The copy doesn't know what.
But we're going to want that. I think there's much more to it, and that's the ramifications of this form, which I don't have a solar system, so I don't know all the details of a solar system. But the questions on here and the questions that are being asked of the seller to disclose to the buyer, it's rather detailed, as a matter of fact. So you can see this is part 2 of that disclosure, and we're going to ask the seller to complete if there is a solar system on the house.
This going to become, should this become part of Sky Slope?
Yes, we're adding this to our checklist, as a matter of fact. Unfortunately, and then
Applicable.
if applicable, right, if applicable. Unfortunately, on the SPQ, it's not clear to a seller when whether they understand that the question is there a PACE or HERO loan? This is a little more obvious, I think. So that's something that's helpful. And that's what's helpful about all these disclosures. It's a reminder for them. That's really what we're hoping to get to. Let's go back. So we covered solar panels, right? And then under section N, no material facts. Remember, the buyer or the seller has an obligation to disclose any insurance claims occurring in the last 5 years. And it doesn't matter if there's a payout or not. If there's a claim filed, that's part of their obligation to disclose, because an insurance company could disregard the claim. Keep that in mind. Then also there's this form, it goes back to 2013 form ARC. I'm not going to show you it, but it gives the listing agent authority from the seller to contact all these different entities to obtain information. I never used the form once in my life.
The buyer can contact the seller.
Actually, it's giving authorization to the
Buyer.
listing agent. So that's what
Buyer with.
that's what it says, right? When I looked at the
Sure.
form. You can probably include it, but I'm not reading it as giving the buyer, even though it says that specifically here. I agree with you. But we're better off just disclosing it. And then let's say, remember, insurability is a contingency, and that's what section 2 is referring to in red. And I had talked about section 14B3 before, and this is in regards to the 5-day rule. Let's just review it so you can see where it is specifically in the contract, so you don't have to go leave and doubt me for the rest of the day. Buyer shall, by the end of the time specified in paragraph 3L, and that's typically 17 days, or actually 17 days, deliver to seller removal of the applicable contingency or cancellation of this agreement. So if they don't remove contingencies, theoretically, they're required to cancel. If they don't cancel, the contingency lives on. However, if any report, disclosure, or information for which seller is responsible, other than those in paragraph 11A or B, is not delivered within the time specified in 3N1, which is 17 days, then buyer has 5 days after delivery of any such item, or the time specified in paragraph 3L, whichever is later. So that's where we get the time frame of the additional 5 days. Because it's talking about 3L, which is 7 days. We talked about form SPPB, seller payment of buyer's brokers compensation, and it's referenced in here under compensation. And then the assignment paragraph is changed, and it's including the word nomination. So a nominee or assignee are deemed to be the same as defined in this paragraph, as a matter of fact. So in terms of assignments, if the buyer is an individual and the buyer assigns their interest to their revocable trust, and in which they are the grantors or the sellers of that trust, they create it, they have 100% interest in it, then the seller has no rights to not agree to the assignment. If it's an entity other than something not owned wholly by the individual on the purchase contract, then the buyer has an obligation to provide information. So for example, even in the case, if it's my trust, I have an obligation to provide evidence that my trust can buy the property. And if that's not done within the 17-day time frame, the seller could reasonably reject the assignment request. If I'm assigning my interest to 2 individual parties that aren't related to me, and I'm getting compensation, remember, I'm supposed to be disclosing that compensation that I'm receiving for that assignment. And the seller does not actually have to agree to that. Seller's entitled to get information from that assignee that they can buy the property. Pre-approval, proof of funds, things of that nature.
Now, into the line of discrimination or whatnot as well, because sometimes the buyer, the seller say, well, I would have never accepted an offer from that person because I don't want to sell to that person. Do they have to have a reason that they don't agree to the assignment?
I think it's just, does the assignee qualify?
Right. Well, if they technically qualify, but the seller's like, I wouldn't have sold to that person.
Well, you're right. I think that would be discriminatory.
Right. But can they do that, or do they have to provide a reason why they're doing it?
I would say that if I were the seller, no matter how negative I was about the buyer and they qualified, I would go forward with the transaction. That would,
Like they're not.
yeah, that would be my approach, and that would be my recommendation to any seller.
So you give a copy of the trust? Is that how you?
You don't have to give a copy of the trust. Well, actually, from one perspective, you have an obligation as the buyer to give the seller or escrow and/or title documentation as to who's buying it and who has evidence to sign, or to prove who has authority to sign on behalf of that entity. So yes, you will be giving that, or certification of trust.
Be responsible for getting a copy.
Yes. And then with that said, the buyer, regardless, is not relieved of their obligation to perform another contract, even if the seller consents to the assignment.
So will the agent get any compensation if you have a buy and broker agreement and now then it's been assigned to somebody else?
I think that's a good question, because it relates to anyone that is anyway related to the buyer. However, if the party that's buying it is not related in any way to the buyer, that's a good question. Are you fully protected? I'd have to look closer at the buyer representation agreement to come to a complete conclusion. I think there would be an argument that you're trying to circumvent it. And I'm, well, not only that, but also I'm the procuring cause in the transaction too. So I think there's another aspect. I think so. I think that it's questionable. It's probably not as strong if it's just the buyer giving it to their own entity as opposed to unrelated entities.
Because sometimes you have two buyers and now they have added a third buyer to the transaction. So the third buyer may say like, I don't want to be paying the extra 10 grand from the buyer broker agreement to this person. Because.
Well, that doesn't preclude the existing two buyers from their obligation. Yeah. Yeah. And then counting days, we've gone through this, but let's just review it again. So acceptance is today, day one is tomorrow. And now it's further giving definitions that are obviously new to this form. But in terms of counting, now if the date of execution of an event, say the removal of a contingency falls in a weekend or legal holiday, or close of escrow falls in a weekend or legal holiday, now it's the ability to delay the transaction, and it's probably reasonable, has been expanded as a matter of fact. So now if the close of escrow and plus the holidays are further defined by civil code and any holiday under government code section 6700. Now I have not looked up the sections or civil code to understand exactly what that means. Before it's a little bit easier, right? But now if the close of escrow falls on a day in which the county recorder is closed, or let's assume the escrow holder and the bank are closed, either or of any of those three, close of escrow then falls to the following business day. So it's not just predicated now on the legal holiday or weekend, it's further extending for the close of escrow to the escrow holder, if they're closed for that day, the county, or the lender. And in addition to that, I think a lot of times when there are seller leasebacks, we always wonder how we begin counting the days of the lease. The day of the close of escrow is day 0. So the following day, when counting the number of days on the lease, would begin the following day following the close of escrow. So if I close today, I have a seller leaseback, day 1 becomes tomorrow for that leaseback agreement. Everybody agrees with electronic signatures. And then there are exceptions to mediation, by the way, and there always have been, but it doesn't negate the benefits of agreeing to mediation. However, there are a couple of exceptions. If I file this pendens and I also notify the court of a stay of litigation, I can do that without giving up my rights to mediation and recovery of attorney's fees. Yes, for acceptance of the contract. Yes. Delivery, right. Acceptance occurs on the last date of delivery. From
Now, if you're missing a signature, it's not uncommon for people to do a counter offer and never have signed the RPA, and then everybody signs the counter offer. But if it takes 2 more days till you get the seller having signed the actual RPA, even though somebody's already sort of opened escrow, et cetera, started to actively do stuff, doesn't day 0 become the day that the seller actually finishes signing all portions of the actual?
I would say yes,
contract?
until that point, you don't have an accepted contract.
Right, even though everybody accepted the counter, the seller hasn't finished signing the actual RPA in the first place.
Well, I would no, if they haven't signed the RPA, I would say that their subsequent actions ratify that purchase contract. So I would say acceptance has occurred, that they've signed the counter offers, even though the seller missed signing the purchase contract.
So the day 0 starts upon signing or fully signing the counter offer, even if the offer is not signed.
Correct.
Really?
Yeah,
Okay.
that would be my interpretation. That would be the argument. Then, of course, the question comes in, did the seller actually see the RPA? Did they intend to agree to the terms on the RPA? It's a different kind of fight, but I would say acceptance is the following delivery of the last signature on the counter offer, even though
The last signature.
even though the RPA was not signed, as it should have been. And then, let's see, go down a little bit farther, and I got a couple of forms just to go over. But in terms of, you can see the address and email address has been added for the agents. And then the designated electronic delivery addresses, I suggest you use that. People will say, I've never received a document. I never received the cancellation. I never received the notice of reform. Well, remember, if you check the box, for example, for the email, you can check all. If you deliver a document to that stipulated address, delivery has been deemed to have occurred. So there's no argument whether somebody got that email or not. If you send it to Richard.Moore, CB Platinum Properties, I can't sit here and say, oh no, I didn't get it. Yeah, they don't want to open their email. That's right. Wussies, right? Let's see. This is a form regards to authorization to receive and convey information, but I don't think I've never witnessed anyone using that form, and it was in effect in 2013. But a couple of other things that are very important. Non-contingent offer advisory, we're probably not seeing any more non-contingent offers, but if we do make a non-contingent offer, we're going to want the buyer to sign this. It tells them about all the pitfalls of submitting a non-contingent offer. Don't need to go over that. You know it.
Only if there's no contingency.
Right.
I'm surprised that you just came out.
Yeah, I know. It's kind of late, isn't it? Yeah. The buyer transactional advisory. I like this form. We're going to include this. It tells the buyer that you have an obligation to read everything.
But then non-contingent offers, so even if you had your seller property resident, nothing, there's no contingency whatsoever.
If you're not going to, if you're going to do that, then have them sign that form, because it's telling them that our advice is that you don't do it. Not that they're going to read it. So I like this form. It tells them you must read it. It also defines the scope of our duties. And it doesn't necessarily sit here and suggest that we must read every page, but we have to provide documentation, information, things of that nature. And they never characterize any type of information you're disclosing. Remember, small crack, big crack, don't worry about it. Whatever the case may be, never characterize. It's just factual information that you're providing to somebody.
That's for the evening.
For anything, as a matter of fact. And then this is very important. So the seller counteroffer and the SMCO is the same, as a matter of fact. And some of the language in here is the same, but under section 1A, and this has now changed, but the liquidated damages and arbitration of disputes paragraphs in the offer each require initials by all parties. So if all the parties to the contract do not initial liquidated damages or arbitration, and theoretically it can be argued that the contract is not complete. So we must complete that by issuing a counteroffer, because it now states if we don't include it, reference it in the counteroffer, then it's excluded from the contract. So if not everybody initials it, then it's not included, but we need to complete the contract itself. All right. And then we talked about this under the section of the RPA referencing seller credits. Unless otherwise agreed or altered in the counteroffer, down payment and loan amounts will be adjusted in the same proportion as in the original offer, but the dollar amount of any initial and increased deposit and seller credits shall remain unchanged. So if I submit an offer for $900,000 and I said I'm putting 20% down, that's my total down payment, then I'm saying I'm putting 180,000 down. Right now that we agree upon a purchase price of $1 million, this is now stating that my total down payment must be $200,000. However, if I negotiated a seller credit of 2% under that section, talking about a seller credit, remember the 2% is only a calculation. If I said I want a $10,000 credit on a $900,000 purchase, if we agree to $1 million, I am still only getting a $10,000 credit. So that is not adjusted based upon the percentage.
If you said you wanted a 1% credit,
You'd have to modify the form.
it would then go.
You could do that, right? But the form itself doesn't lend it itself to that. So that's what's deceiving. It shows a percentage and it gives you the thought that it's a percentage, just like the total down payment.
So now they say you have your offer accepted at say 900, and then if you want to sell a buy down of the interest rate, once you have the offer accepted, then resubmit the offer with a higher price, saying that now that, and then ask the seller for the credit. Is that
You can modify in the counteroffer. You'd have to, right? Otherwise, it's going to be whatever the dollar credit you requested was in the initial offer. Does that make sense?
So just get it accepted at 900,000, then modifies it. We are resubmitting it at 920, and the seller has to credit back 20,000 for.
Right. Or you could say a percentage of the purchase price, as Paul was suggesting. Yeah. That's probably a safer way to approach it in the counteroffer, that the seller credit shall be equal to 1% of the purchase price.
And then, the seller cannot credit more, like a buyer cannot receive a credit of more than the recurring, or the closing costs, right? But you can
Right.
have a recurring, non-recurring, even though the buy down of the credit rate is not considered.
So you're saying the credit exceeds the total buyer's closing costs?
Yeah.
So remember, to address that in the purchase contract or in a counteroffer, you must state that any unused credit, and it doesn't matter for what the source is, by the way, will be used as a direct dollar amount reduction against the purchase price. But if you don't specify that, you're going to lose that additional credit that would have been available to the buyer.
But if you wanted, was reducing the interest rate and not.
You could, right?
And then say any additional credit would go towards reduction of the interest rate.
Well, you don't even have to say that. If you just find out that the total closing costs are less than the total credit, then you're going to do something. Buy down the rates, prepay association dues, something to use up that credit. If you haven't specified, it's going to be a reduction in the purchase price.
So you have to specify it in the counteroffer.
Yes. Or in the offer. That would be my approach. I would specify that specifically in the offer. Because I think it's under section 5, it talks about the loss of the credit. Or the potential loss. Let's find it here. We're almost done, guys. There is more champagne in the back. What was that? You want me too? I'm out. Here it is, section 5E. Any credit to buyers specified or otherwise agreed from any source for closing or other costs as agreed to by the parties shall be disclosed to buyer's lender, if any, and made at close of escrow. If the total credit allowed by buyer's lender is less than the contractual credit, that the contractual credit from seller shall be reduced to the lender allowable credit. So if I said I want a credit of 15,000, the lender only allows 14,000, I can only use $14,000, right? And in the absence of a separate written agreement between the parties, there shall be no automatic adjustment to the purchase price to make up for the difference between the contractual credit and the lender allowable credit. So that $1,000, if I didn't state any unused or unallowable credit will be used as a direct reduction in the purchase price, I could lose that. Seller would be dumb not to agree to that, but a year ago, they wouldn't have agreed to it. We're gonna say, too bad. Today, different story. Yeah. I don't really want, it's already after 11 o'clock. Sorry, guys. We'll save that for another time. But there are dramatic changes made to the lease listing agreement also, by the way. Go through that next week. And the lease, yeah. So in both the seller counteroffer, seller multiple counteroffer, and the buyer counteroffer, the language in terms of the adjustment of the down payment is in here, and addressing the closing cost credit. It's based upon the dollar amount and not the percentage. So it doesn't adjust if the purchase price adjusts. And one other thing, oh yes, sorry. And this is in the SCO, SMCO, and BCO. Under the appraisal aspect of the purchase contract, we can actually stipulate an appraised value less than the purchase price. We saw a lot of those. As a matter of fact, I'm buying it for $1 million, but it only has to appraise for $900,000. So there's $100,000 difference, right? So this is now saying that if we agree to a purchase price that's different, the appraisal must only come in $100,000 less than the agreed upon purchase price. So if I offered 900 or $1 million, and I said the appraisal value only has to come in at $900,000, and it comes in and we agree to $1.1 million, the appraised value must only come in at $1 million. Yes, the difference, whatever the difference is based upon the original offer price and the amount you stipulated the appraisal must come in at. Well, I must have misspoken. But if we offer $1 million and we say the appraisal must come in at 900,000, do we agree it's $100,000 difference? Okay. So now if the adjusted purchase price is $1.1 million, for me to use the appraisal contingency, the appraised value must come in less than $1 million. So that delta of $100,000 remains.
Yeah, it's no longer 900.
Yes, it's no longer 900, correct. It's just the difference between the original offer price and the amount you stipulated as being the minimum appraised value.
Whatever the buyer is going to make up
Yes,
doesn't change.
doesn't change, correct. That delta doesn't change.
Dollar figure.
Yeah, yes, thank you. All right, any questions?
Is there a place, rather than us just being caught unaware or going to listen to you, is there a place where CAR or somebody says, here's all the new updated versions of the forms, or here's all the names of everything that we've now either created new or made changes to?
Yes, under, if you go log into your CAR accounts under Transaction Center, and then there's another selection called CAR Forms or something to that effect. It's not, it's under car.org.
That's where all those are.
Yes, all the forms, right, all the forms are in a completely different platform. Yeah.
But keep saying the zip form, if it's your classic or whatever.
Classic is the desktop version, that's my understanding. Zipform Plus is the online version. I think that's the only difference. Carlos, is it?
They changed the format of it. They upgraded it to a newer system where you can fill everything out and I think also add the signers or something. But the classic one is what we're used to seeing with the yellow highlighted spaces to fill in. But the newer version is different.
They both free.
Yeah.
Well, the newer,
Yeah.
the newer version lets you create something, and you need to, you can import into your window that you're adjusting or signing all of the forms.
Is that what it does?
Yeah, I
The
mean,
new,
you can
I see.
say, okay, pick all of these forms, and I'm just gonna start going down them and making, you know, adding in what I need to add in. It's
Have
not
you-
for the
have you used
signing
it?
thing. Yeah, I don't like it.
Yeah.
I think eventually they're gonna it's very
Correct, eventually they're gonna make everybody do it. Why would they offer something as just an option?
I think just to get.
It's confusing.
It's gonna be a
Yeah.
replacement.
Yeah. But there is a desktop version, but remember, you need to update your forms and it tells you to update your forms on the desktop version. Otherwise, you may not have the most recent form releases. And we'll sync also. Now, it's funny what I see in terms of older forms, and you're insured in a sense by the California Association of Realtors against the viability of the forms, but it's only referencing the most current forms. You use an older form and there's an issue in that form, they're not going to indemnify you or cover you. Yeah. Well, there's another reason to use the most current forms instead of using the old forms, plus the references, none of it makes sense. Okay. Well, thank you for coming today. Any other questions? No? All right. Good seeing you. We'll see you next week. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
You're all opening up the door.
This is gonna be like.
What's that? Find it, 30 years.